Hello, greetings and salutations, A-Push. This is the day before the AP test. Yikes! Hey, we're going to do the last little review over first semester and a couple things from January. And we're going to start off with the American Civil War. Behind me here are all my books and things that I own about the Civil War militarily. And guess what? AP could care less about, let me take you a walkabout here, could care less about the battles of the Civil War. So we're just going to go through what is most relevant, probably, for AP. And as we maybe, come on, load up. Like they're not going to care about the strategies for the both sides to win the war. They're not going to care about the first Battle of Bull Run. They're not going to care about McClellan and the Peninsula Campaign. This hurts my heart. They're not going to care about Ulysses S. Grant's war in the West. But we could mention the Battle of Antietam, and the reason and that was the bloodiest day in American history, 23,000 people killed. The reason that this is significant is that Northern victory gave Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He issued it in September of 1862 and told the Confederacy, put down your guns and you can keep your slaves, but if you wait until January 1st, I'm going to free the slaves. Well, when it goes into effect, it doesn't actually free anybody because he frees only the slaves in states that were still in rebellion. It didn't free a single slave in Missouri. It's a political document, though, that does let the South know that this is a war now, not just of reunion, but of liberating the slaves. And it also helps to keep England and France from possibly jumping in and siding with the Confederates. So we'll leave Emancipation Proclamation in there. Do not, under any circumstances, say that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. That was the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves. Okay, so let's shrink that guy down and bring up 13.2, the home front. They're not going to care about the northern advantages. They might care about the Homestead Act, things that were accomplished during the on the home front. The Homestead Act, remember this is 1862. We're going to bring it back up again in a moment. Provided free land for settlers if you moved out there to the west. The Pacific Railroad Act, which was the funding for the Transcontinental Railroad, and a Legal Tender Act, which created the idea of greenback paper money. We're going walkabout. Greenback paper money, which change over time. If you happen to get something about the populists or the progressives, remember the populists, the angry farmers, they wanted silver money and in some cases in the Omaha platform paper money. This right here is a Civil War era 50-cent piece. It's paper. It's paper. They made even the change was paper. So, no, possibly African American troops. If you get a question on social changes, you've got African Americans, the 54th Massachusetts Regimental Infantry. By the end of the Civil War, over 180,000 African Americans were in the Union Army, and Abraham Lincoln actually credited them with helping to turn the tide of the war. This coming out of the Civil War with women and the Sanitary Commission is going to lead to the American Red Cross. They're not going to care about the Battle of Vicksburg or Gettysburg. Oh. And Ulysses S. Grant and his brilliant campaign. Okay, so much for Chapter 13, Part 2. Now we need to go to 13, Part 3, the end of the war. The Union victorious. Go full screen here. Remember the big cutout of Grant in the back of the classroom? That's cool. They're not going to care about Grant's overland campaign, doggone it, or the fall of Atlanta, but they might care about this little thing. The 13th Amendment passed Congress January 31st, 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States. And they're not going to care about the end of the war, Sherman's march, or Lincoln's assassination, which really hurts. That's what Lincoln said. Not very nice, Mr. George. Okay, so let's go to Chapter 14. This is where I'm thinking AP may have more things to talk about, and that is the era of Reconstruction. When the South was rebuilt and readmitted to the Union, Abraham Lincoln had a plan. He'd had it since the early years of the war, called the 10% plan. That if a Southern state just if a Confederate state put down its guns, and 10% of the people swore loyalty to the government, and then that state ratified the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, they could come back in. Lincoln's critics in his own party, the radical Republicans, said that wasn't strong enough, and they wanted this Wade Davis bill, which had the ironclad oath that you had to swear on your heart of hearts that you'd never supported the Confederacy. And a majority of people in the state had to make this oath before the state could come back in. Well, that's ludicrous. There's no way that you're going to get a majority of people in a Confederate state to say they didn't support the Confederacy. Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill by just refusing to sign it. So Andrew Johnson takes over because Lincoln is murdered. And he's got the restoration plan where he's going to give amnesty to all Confederates. It means he's going to give them like no crime. He's not going to charge them with treason or anything. For everything except for super high-ranking Confederate officials like Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee. Remember, he hated wealthy landowners, and so those people had to take a special loyalty oath. States had to revoke their ordinances of secession. They had to give up Civil War debts, Confederate debts, pass the 13th Amendment. And then, in these states that were coming back in, they started to pass these black codes, these former Confederate states that were forcing the freed slaves back onto the plantations, denying them their rights. Andrew Johnson said nothing about black codes, so the South was pretty pleased with it, all in general. And then the South starts voting people to Congress. Like Georgia elects Alexander Stephens back to the United States Congress. Well, just a few months before, he'd been the vice president of the Confederate States of America. I mean, for crying out loud, they're not going to let this guy back in to the Congress. No Northern Republican Congress is going to let that happen. So, here we go. The battle over Reconstruction. The DBQ that I've graded that a couple of you sent is about how the period between 1860 and 1877 represented a revolution. And this is the revolutionary part right here. This is the revolution that occurs. So Congress is going to pass a Freedmen's Bureau to try and prevent discrimination against the freed slaves, and a Civil Rights Act of 1866 to get rid of those black codes that granted citizenship to the freed slaves and equal protection of the law. Andrew Johnson vetoes them. But both times he vetoes them, but Congress, which is all Republicans, and Andrew Johnson, remember, is a Democrat. Lincoln picked him, showing the South that he was going to be their friend. The Congress overrides the veto. What happened there? Go back. Oh, look at that. Remind me later. I'm going to pause you for a second. I got to figure out what happened. Hey, am I back? Sorry about that. My computer decided to do something crazy. Anyway, so we had talked about the 14th Amendment, which gets passed, which says that if you're born here, you're a citizen. No state can take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which is every legal opportunity that you have to prove you didn't do it, and that all citizens should have equal protection under the law. Andrew Johnson's against this, but he's outnumbered with Congress as 3-1 Republican majority, and so the 14th Amendment becomes law as well. So, close that guy down. 1423, Reconstruction. Whoops, we didn't need to do that. We just need full screen. All right, so the fight for land. The freed slaves needed land, and here was the great opportunity. Some Northern Republicans thought that the South, these the freed slaves should become, independent cotton farmers. President Johnson says no, and he orders all the confiscated Confederate land to be returned to their proper owners. And then the landowners then force the freed slaves back into a form of virtual slavery. What I think I called it economic slavery, which is called sharecropping, where the landlord provides the seeds and the tools, the freedman works a plot of land, pays the landlord 50% or more of the crop as rent, and they fall into permanent debt to their landlord, and their landlord is, guess who? Their former owner. So it's a version of economic slavery, and by 1890, 3 out of 4 African Americans are sharecroppers. Now I want to comment on the Revolution FRQ or DBQ or whatever of this time period. This is not good. 3 out of 4 African Americans are sharecroppers, and their rights are being denied. There's no doubt about that. However, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment have extended incredible amount of liberties that would eventually, later as we go down the line of history, is going to extend tons and tons of rights and privileges to all of us that weren't there before. Okay, In the South after the Civil War, under military Reconstruction, African Americans were allowed to vote. And this was this time period where Hiram Revels was elected to the United States Senate from Mississippi. He's the first black U.S. Senator, and he took Jefferson Davis's old seat. Former Confederates are furious because African Americans are voting, but very few white Southerners can vote under the radical Reconstruction. So we get the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is the last radical Reconstruction law that said that there's equality before the law, there's no discrimination in public transportation or accommodations. The right of African Americans to serve on juries is okay. So here we go. For a short time period, about 10 years after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1875, African Americans had a lot of rights in the South, but they were all kind of backed up by the U.S. military. Moving on about President Grant. All right, so Reconstruction rolled back. What some people called the Redeemers. I don't like that term. But a lot of white Southerners, the majority of white Southerners, thought that the Reconstruction governments in their states, established by the U.S. government, the Northern government, they thought these were illegitimate. And they worked really hard to get ex-Confederates their voting rights back. And to do that, they created the Ku Klux Klan, the terrorist organization that attacked the carpetbaggers, any Northerners who had moved south after the war to run banks or construction companies, scalawags, any former Southerner who supported the Republicans. Those people were attacked. By 1870, the Klan was everywhere in the South and trying to kick out all the Republicans and restore Democrats to power and restore white supremacy. For a short while during the Grant administration, he's passed the Enforcement Act, or the Ku Klux Klan Act, which sent the military down into the South to try and break up the Klan. But it's difficult. That you could arrest a guy for being a Ku Kluxer, put him on trial, but he's going to be on a trial by a jury of his peers, which is going to be a bunch of white people. And all these all white Southern juries are going to find this guy is not guilty. So it was very difficult to enforce the Enforcement Act. How ironic is that? It's hard to enforce the Enforcement Act. It's not forceful enough. All right, this one we did in early January. Native Americans and the impact of Western settlement. You remember this picture of this massacre of Wounded Knee? And we looked at this map of what land was owned by whites and versus Native Americans is in the dark color. This is America 1850, America 1865, America 1880, and America 1990. The whites have taken it all from Native Americans. We mentioned the Homestead Act. This is if you got 160 acres of federal land out in Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakota Territory. If you moved out there, if you built a house, if you farmed the property, if you stayed for 5 years, if you managed to survive the 5 years on the plains, the land became yours. The next one was the Morrill Act, which gave 140 million acres of land to the federal government if they built universities there, what are called the land-grant colleges, to study. It increases education opportunities, but the goal was to study agricultural and mining improvements. All right? And these laws, because it's basically free land, is going to lead to waves of immigration from Northern Europe, from places like Sweden and Norway. That's why folks up in that part of the country talk almost, yeah, oh yeah, people up in Minnesota. That's why they have those accents, those Northern European. Okay, how did we deal with the Native Americans? Answer, were we fair? No. Not since the Pilgrims landed and ate the Wampanoag's corn at the Plymouth colony. No, we haven't been getting along real well. All right, 1851, we got the Fort Laramie Treaty, which said that the government said the Native American territory is for Native Americans only. They did this to guarantee safe passage for pioneers on the Oregon Trail. But with the passing of the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, that violates the treaties. So we had the short-lived Dakota War of 1862, when the Sioux living in Minnesota rose up. They were fiercely angry at the corrupt Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, massacred something like 400 people in Minnesota and Iowa. And Abraham Lincoln took their death sentences when the government finally put down the rebellion. Minnesota had sentenced 300 Sioux Indians to hang. Lincoln reduced that number to 38, but he did banish the Sioux Indians from Minnesota and Iowa. And so this is going to lead to great tension between white settlers and Native Americans all over the Great Plains, everywhere. Wow, look at that giant pile of bones. So we've got a series of massacres, the Sand Creek Massacre, where the United States, or a Colorado militia group, went out and attacked and killed 100 Cheyenne women and children. The Native Americans respond with the Fort Fetterman Massacre, where they wiped out 80 soldiers and then closed off an important trail up into Montana. So, because there's all this trouble, there's another treaty between us and the Native Americans, the Fort Laramie Treaty, where we promised the Native Americans, cross our hearts, they could have South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota forever and ever. Right up until white people who were creeping onto the Indian land discovered gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota and their land got taken away. The number one thing to drive the Native Americans into the hands of the United States government was the destruction of the buffalo. The buffalo, remember, was everything the tribes needed. It was their food, their clothing, their shelter. By the time we were done, we had taken the buffalo herd from multiple millions of animals down to less than 1,000 by 1900. And this is absolutely the biggest thing that's going to drive the Native Americans onto the reservations. And President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, he didn't think it was nice to be awful to these Indians. He had one of his close friends was Eli Parker, who was a full-blooded Seneca Indian, and so Grant came up with what's called the peace policy. Now, this is peaceful, and it's a good policy, a peace policy only if you look at it from the white person's perspective. The white people thought they were trying to be nice to the Native Americans. They wanted to assimilate them into white culture. Remember, that means to make them become part of our culture. They pushed Indians onto reservations, which was land that the white government wanted. Think about this. If the U.S. government doesn't want it, and white settlers don't want it, the Native Americans probably don't want it either. It's probably not great land, but they're forcing them onto these reservations. In particular, Oklahoma. What used to be on old maps, you look at Oklahoma, and it doesn't say Oklahoma. It says Indian Nation. Well, in the 1890s, they discovered oil in the Indian Nation, and boom, the Native Americans are going to be shoved from the whole state of Oklahoma into one tiny county. One teeny tiny county. Another thing you're going to try is the Indian boarding schools, like the Carlisle Indian School, where they take young Indian children away from their parents in the West and ship them to the East, force them to wear white man's clothes, cut their hair, force them to convert to Christianity. And by 1871, Congress has abolished treaty making with Native American tribes. Native American tribe takes it to court, and in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock in 1903, the Supreme Court said, you know what, the government can do whatever they want to Native Americans, and they can ignore any treaties they've ever made, because Native Americans are wards of the state. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote the book, A Century of Dishonor, in 1881, talking about the horrible injustices we've done to these Native Americans, and sent a copy to every member of Congress. And so Congress starts to create a committee about how can we be nicer to Native Americans. And the first one is the Dawes Act. And the idea behind this is we're going to give 160 acres of reservation land to the head of each Native American household. But as you can see by the poster, Indian land for sale, get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title and possession within 30 days. This law wasn't really followed. Farm equipment that was supposed to be delivered to the Indians rarely showed up. If they found any resources on your reservation, they took your land. The Indian affairs officials were corrupt. Any land that didn't get used by the wasn't settled as a farm because the reservations were much larger than the population, then that unused land was sold to white settlers. So the unintended consequences of this really fine book was that it actually helped deliver the death blow to Native American communities. It dissolved their tribal community, their nomadic way of life, dissolved tribal governments, made them poor independent farmers that were dependent on the United States government. There won't be anything about the Battle of Little Bighorn. But you could mention at the end, if you should get something on Native Americans, that the last end of Native American resistance was the ghost dance, the ritual that the Sioux Indians believed would bring back their dead warriors, that it would restore the buffalo population, that wearing these special shirts would protect them from bullets. Having people thinking doing this dance made the U.S. government nervous. They thought it could lead to some kind of an uprising. So at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, in December of 1890, the U.S. Army rounded up a bunch of of them tried to confiscate their weapons. There's confusion, and the confusion, the shots fired, and the U.S. Army, using cannons that can fire 60 shells a minute, unloaded on the Native Americans and killed 150 of them at least. And here they are pitching them all into a giant pit in South Dakota. And this is the last of the Indian Wars, and the end of Indian resistance was with this thing right here, this horrible event, the massacre of Wounded Knee. Okay, gang, that's the first semester reviewed, and I'm going to hope that second semester's in your brain. I'm going to post another video later, I think. Maybe. We'll see. Good luck tomorrow, my friends. Don't cheat. Don't cheat. Don't get in on any phones. Don't start any group me's. They'll invalidate all of our scores, man. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Do it honestly. It's open note. Have your notes organized.